Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Behind the Camera, a decade photographing Yellowstone and Grand Teton, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm calling in from Adirondack Park, and it's a beautiful sunny day here, and I'm so excited to share with you one of my favorite places in the world, Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park. Just to give you a sense of what we'll cover today, I'd love to share a little bit of my background in conservation photography, and then we'll explore the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem through a number of photographs I've taken over the last 10 years. And then finally, I'll share with you a quick look at Natural Habitat Adventures itinerary for exploring these places, so that if you get inspired and want to go explore Grand Teton and Yellowstone, you can see what it's like to join NatHab on a trip like that. So it all begins in the Northwoods. I fell in love with exploring wild places in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and this was one of my first photographs that I took with a DSLR on Lake Michigamme. And it's really a place that I just fell in love with, chasing animals and wildlife and just exploring the world. And that led me to study biology. And in particular, I studied soft-shell turtles. And so research that I was working on, the Minnesota DNR wanted to know essentially the health of these two species that they found in the Mississippi River and watersheds. And in particular, they wanted to know if the smooth softshell turtle population was healthy. And the way we answered that question was by doing a population genetic study. So we were taking tissue samples, doing a ton of trapping of turtles so that we could trap and release them as we were studying them. And ultimately, that research showed that the smooth softshell turtle actually had significantly lower genetic diversity than the spiny softshell turtle. And we were able to make a recommendation to the DNR to be able to conserve habitat and focus on nesting areas and the riverine habitat that these turtles need to survive. So that really launched my interest in wildlife. And while I was doing this research, I was surrounded by turtles and creatures. And so at the research station, it was just this playground for photography. And I started to realize as I was starting to share this research through presentations like this, that I really love the communication side of science. And so that really launched my career, and I've photographed various different scientific projects. Here it's working on Saw-Whet Owl project and banding project. And I've worked as a photojournalist and editor for conservation magazines, and most recently as an exhibit developer for the Climate Solutions exhibit at the Wild Center, which is near my home in the Adirondacks. And all of these things have allowed me to explore just phenomenal ecosystems around the world and get to know amazing companies that are working on conserving these places. And the trips with Natural Habitat Adventures, when I'm guiding the Monarch trip, the Grand Teton and Yellowstone trips, and also the Canyons trips, all of these opportunities are just places where we can learn together about all of these incredible plants and animals that we share this one home with. So today, I really want to dive into one of those places, and that is the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. So I'd love to walk through photographs that I've taken over the past 10 years, tell you the stories behind them, have you meet some of the wildlife and the places that make this place just so special. Now, this is a heavily photographed area. Historically speaking, when we think about like the giants in landscape photography, like Ansel Adams, Joe Reese, all of these people have just made this place famous over time and have helped contribute to the conservation of this landscape. And all of these photographers, including myself, are drawn to it for, I would say these three big factors, along with so many others. These landscapes are vast, and it just gives you this incredible scale to be able to play with the light as it moves across the landscape. And then there's also all of these charismatic fauna. We talk about the megafauna, the moose, the bear, the elk, the wolves, but for me, it's every fauna. Obviously, being a person who studied softshell turtles, I get excited about the amphibians and the snakes and all of the tiny flora and fauna that you can find. And also just this convergence of wildlife, landscape, and geothermal features. So Yellowstone National Park being the home to a super volcano, it just creates this nexus of environments that's so much fun and to explore and to study. And so let's take a look behind the camera at some shots. This first shot, when I first moved to Wyoming, I moved to Kelly, Wyoming, and that's a spot that you're inside Grand Teton National Park, and you just have this stunning view of the Tetons. And one of the first weekends I was there, I went on a backcountry trip, and the first night was this massive thunderstorm. Really scary. We all spread out in an even stand of trees. We were way up the canyon and you know, followed the procedures for a big lightning storm like that. And we all were okay. Nothing, you know, no one was struck by lightning. But the next morning, the fog cleared out, and this shot was taken early morning with the mist in the mountains. And this is at a special spot called the Forks of Cascade Canyon. So this is, you know, one of the first photographs that I took in the area when I first moved there. Further up that trail, you end up in Alaska Basin. And this location is in an alpine meadow and alpine lake, just really stunning environment. And this was taken right at sunset. This was the view that I had, yeah, every day waking up. And so these mountains just became, you know, a study for light and texture, and every single day they looked different. Sometimes they appeared really far away, and sometimes they felt like they were right in your face. And just experiencing that day after day was such an amazing time to be able to play with photography and light and see what different situations can do. And you know, I always had it in my head, and whenever I'm exploring this place, I'm thinking about all the photographers who have been in this area, and I'm trying to riff off of what they've done or try to capture something that maybe hasn't been captured before. And so that's where some of these photographs are coming from. And this photo really is near and dear to my heart because it's really right from the location where I was living in Ditch Creek while I was a graduate student at Teton Science Schools. And so this view of the stars over the Tetons is just really special. In the springtime, the valley just explodes with plant life, and one of them that just blankets everything is arrowleaf balsam root. So this photo is a really typical spring phenomena where you have these big storm systems moving across the mountains, across the wide open valley, and then you can get really interesting compositions with wildflowers in the foreground. So I get really excited about these opportunities. And I was just guiding a trip at the end of May and the beginning of June. And that, if you're interested in photographing wildflowers in Grand Teton or Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, you know, that is definitely the time to do that. So just diving into some of the wildlife that make this place so special. You know, Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is this vast landscape that is, you know, the largest contiguous or mostly protected area in North America. And when you look at temperate ecosystems around the world, it's among the largest. And so it's able to support some of these really big wildlife that other areas in North America cannot support. So this one we endearingly call the speed goat. It's a pronghorn, and often people refer to it as an antelope. But it is not related to antelopes. So this is in fact the fastest land mammal in North America, and they can reach speeds of 60 miles per hour, which when you look at predators on this landscape, today there is no predator that can outrun a pronghorn. And so when you think about evolution and the pressures on this animal, you have to ask the question, why did they evolve to be this fast? And the answer lies in animals that are no longer on the landscape. So the pronghorn actually evolved alongside a North American cheetah. and that is why it adapted to be able to run 60 miles per hour and be the fastest land mammal in North America. So really fun to photograph, and this one was just, you know, I personally, as a wildlife photographer, I do not have a long lens. I have a 300 millimeter as my longest lens, and so I rely on my ecological knowledge and background to safely and respectfully be close enough to wildlife to be able to photograph them without impacting their behavior. So often wildlife photographers will be shooting with like a 800 millimeter or even longer than that. And so this was a really fun moment where I was just posted up in one spot and the pronghorn just kind of kept moving closer and closer, and eventually was looking at me from, you know, maybe 50 yards when I took this picture. Pronghorn love the wide open sagebrush flats. So this is a close-up image of a sagebrush, and you're seeing on that sagebrush leaf these 3 lobes. And if you look at the scientific name of sagebrush, it's called Artemisia tridentata. And tridentata means 3 teeth. So you look at those leaves and it helps you identify that plant. But when you go back to pronghorn, here the pronghorn is in that sagebrush, and they love the flats because they can see any predators that are approaching. And they also are able to forage in that area. And a lot of these places in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem are fairly nutrient poor, so that there isn't a ton of plant diversity. So they have to be really well adapted to be able to survive out in that area. So they've actually adapted to be able to eat sagebrush, which has a toxin within it that most animals can't process. And they're actually able to feed on this and supplement their diet. And of course, you know, this was on a fishing trip to the Snake River and hiking back. I happened to have my camera, and a bull moose came right across my path, making its way. And something I love about this photo is it captures some of that motion. You know, I think if I had had more time, I probably would have tried to do a faster shutter speed and really freeze everything in the image to make it really crisp. But I kind of like the happy accident that that front leading foot has a little bit of motion behind it. I just really enjoy this shot because it's at one of my favorite places in the world, which is near the Muir Ranch in Grand Teton National Park. So something that's really unique that happens, I was living in Kelly, Wyoming, and right in that Ditch Creek drainage, something happens that maybe happens other places, but hasn't been documented anywhere else. And that is that in the spring, moose gather in huge numbers. You'll see sometimes 15 or 20 moose in one small area in Grand Teton National Park. And folks have been studying this and trying to understand what's going on, but this photo I took while I was looking at a whole field of moose, and this one just happened to be very close to me. So it's my theory that perhaps this happens in other areas, but this is just a very visible location where we can see this happening. It's not during mating season, which happens in the fall. So it's just a really unique phenomena that happens in Grand Teton. That was really fun to photograph. I love this photo for the lighting and the focus on the antlers and the crisp image in the eye. And if you look really closely, you can actually see another elk in that elk's eye reflected. And this was taken on the National Elk Refuge just north of Jackson Hole. And as you've been looking at this, maybe you've noticed that there's something missing. So this elk does not have ears. And if you look really closely, that where the ears should be is just a stub. And that's actually, you know, the theory is perhaps this individual had a really hard winter, got frostbite, and especially maybe when it was a young calf, and has been a successful, healthy bull elk since. But really fun picture of that individual. A lot of people know this particular elk in that area because it returns year after year to that part of the elk refuge. Here, moving into the springtime, this was taken in June in Yellowstone. I was moving along a path and looked into the trees, and 10 feet into the trees were this calf and her cow. And So I backed up to a safe distance. They didn't seem to mind that I was there, and I took this photograph before moving on. But looking at this fawn, it was probably days old, if not younger than that, when I took this photo. Heading up into Yellowstone in the Lamar Valley, you just have herds of bison just expanding across all of these sagebrush flats. And in the springtime, if you're lucky enough to be there, then you get the chance to see baby bison. And they are so much fun to see play. They just zoom around their parents and are so excited, playing with each other. And so these shots were taken while we had been set up looking for wolves in the morning, and then hadn't seen anything, and the bison were just putting on a show for us the whole time. That's a really good memory. So bison, as they age and they get older, sometimes male bison in particular will go off on their own. So they're a herd animal. They spend most of their lives together. But this shot I took north of the elk refuge, where a lot of the animals converge in the winter. It was snowing that day. It was the beginning of winter. And this bison was alone. And I just remember feeling like I was sharing this moment with this animal, and just the pose of the way he's looking off to the right and surrounded by the cottonwoods and the sagebrush. This image just really sits with me in a different way. So I love, if you're visiting Yellowstone or this area in the summer, I really like to think about what the plants and animals have to survive throughout the year. So this is a frozen landscape. Snow is 5-6 feet deep in places, and it's bitter, bitter cold. So all of these plants and animals have incredible adaptations to be able to survive, and it also creates these incredible opportunities for photos. So this animal in particular is heavily adapted to a winter environment. So this is a trumpeter swan. And to me, I love this picture because I love the composition of it, but I also like the scientific story behind it. So waterfowl and trumpeter swans in particular have what's called counter current exchange. So if you were to look at their veins and arteries, you would see that they're wrapped around each other. And what that does is it allows for heat exchange as blood is leaving the body. So it slowly cools the blood so that by the time it reaches the extremities, it's closer to the temperature of its surroundings and thus loses less heat. And then as that blood is coming back, it is getting heated up by the vessels that it's surrounding, and it re-enters the body warmed up. And so that system reduces overall heat loss and allows birds to be able to sit in that really, really cold water on the ice. Whenever you're looking out, it's just really hard to understand how they can be surviving that way. And countercurrent heat exchange is one of the ways that they're able to do that. This image is really important to me. It's taken in Lamar Valley, and aspen are one of my favorite trees. They're absolutely incredible when you start looking into the biology of them and the ecology of them. They are a super organism. So what we think of as an individual tree is actually just a rammet of the larger gamete, which is the full organism. So the organism is shooting up these rammets, these individual trees, and they're genetically identical to the full organism itself. And so the superorganism of aspen stands will live for centuries. And I think the oldest documented one in the world has been dated to 2,500 years old, which is just mind-boggling. So what's happening here is this stand of aspen is dying. And in this photo, I took it in the springtime. Perhaps these trees will leaf out and grow, but I've been watching them. I took this about 10 years ago, and I've been watching these trees, and they seem to be dying back, and they're not recruiting other trees underneath them. So to me, it's just this kind of captured moment in time where there is this perfect symmetrical asymmetry happening. And what makes this image really special for me, and I actually have it on the wall behind me, is that right behind me when I was taking this picture, I'm at the tree line in Lamar Valley, and I had just visited the den, the historic den of a wolf one of the first wolves that was reintroduced to the park in 1995 after they were extirpated, removed from this ecosystem. And so the den site, if you know where it is, you're able to visit it. It's no longer active. It is abandoned at this point, and it's just kind of a scrape under a tree. So I had just visited that den site, and I came out and I saw this aspen stand that seems to be on its way out, and was just thinking about the history of wolves. And so this piece is called Valley of the Wolves. It's a really, really special spot. Speaking of Valley of the Wolves, this wolf in particular is one that I've seen. I saw her 3 years running, and I probably saw her 4 times over a stretch of 5 years. Her name is she's identified as 926F in the wolf reintroduction program. Collared wolves, you can actually see her radio collar. It's a little bit orange on her neck. Are given an identification number, and then they are studied. And so we have this, the Yellowstone National Park is the first national park, and it's essentially this incredible research station where we've been able to see what happens when we remove as much human influence as possible. And so when we reintroduce wolves, a lot of researchers converged in Yellowstone to be able to study what was happening there and see what happens when wolves are allowed to run free in a landscape. So this wolf in particular is the great granddaughter of the wolf who denned at this location in Lamar Valley. And her story is much too long to get into on this webinar, but perhaps in a future webinar, and you can also check out some stories that I've written about her. She was a really successful wolf in this area, and I had this incredible opportunity where I was watching her mate feed on a carcass on the Lamar River down below the hitching post, which is a famous pull-off in Lamar Valley. And while I was watching him, behind me, she moved down the hillside until she was very, very close to where I was, and I was just sitting in one position. And again, I don't have a long lens, and so she was fairly close to me at this point when I took this photo. And just an incredible experience, and I'd love to share more about this wolf. If you're interested, you can reach out and I'll share that story. Now, we haven't shown too many photos of just the colors that happen in Yellowstone. On the far right, this is a picture of Lamar Valley. In the middle is a feather that happened to land in some algae that is growing near thermal features, and on the left we have a hot spring, and it's so much fun to just experiment and try different compositions and play with the lighting in these areas. And every minute the weather is changing, the lighting is changing, so it's just a very exciting place to photograph. Here's a raven. These birds are omnipresent. They are everywhere, and they're really fascinating. So if you're ever wildlife watching in this area, watching for birds is a great way to be able to find where animals may have made a kill, or to follow the wolves. And so we're always scanning the sky, looking for ravens, looking for hawks and eagles. And this was just an opportunity where this raven happened to be very friendly and came very close. And just they're incredibly smart birds. All of the birds in the corvid family, Corvidae, are very, very smart animals, and are able to use tools to be able to get food, and just an amazing animal to follow. This one is obviously near and dear to me, and this is the last photo that I'll share from the collection. This is a boreal toad, and I share this because so often we go on these trips and we go to these areas to be able to see the charismatic megafauna. And if there's one thing you take away from today, it's that everything down to the smallest turtle or insect is fascinating to look at and to explore. And this animal in particular is all the amphibians in Yellowstone National Park are kind of the canary in the coal mine. We're studying their populations to see if there's any issue, because they are often the first ones to respond if there's a change happening. And with global climate change and pollution and a number of different factors, these critters are going to be the first ones to experience any negative impacts. And so all the studies that are going into the smallest of our companions are really informing what we know about what's happening to the world. If you're interested in looking at more photos from Yellowstone and Grand Teton, you can head to twoline.com and check out the gallery. That brings you over here. And on the far left, you see Grand Teton and Yellowstone on the left-hand navigation. And so you're welcome to explore photographs to your heart's content, including photos that we explored today. But as promised, I want to do a quick look at the itinerary that Natural Habitat Adventures offers to be able to explore Yellowstone and Grand Teton. I'll be guiding this trip in September this year, and I typically guide with Natural Habitat Adventures about 4 times a year. The rest of the year, I'm working on conservation photography and storytelling through video and writing. So let's dive in. This is a 7-day itinerary, and if you look at the stars on the map, this trip either goes from Bozeman in the north down to Jackson in the south, or it runs the reverse trip. Both of the itineraries have their benefits. I love guiding both of them, and I couldn't recommend both of them enough. So if you're wondering which way to go, you can talk to someone at NatHab who can kind of talk through those different reasons to be able to take one or the other. These trips are huge wildlife trips, so you're trying to see as much as possible, and we really gear our days, our itineraries, and where we're staying and where we're going to be able to maximize that as much as possible. And obviously, getting to travel through Yellowstone, we're focusing on being able to visit all those iconic geothermal features as well. So for the purposes of this presentation, we'll start in Jackson Hole and we'll make our way up to Bozeman. So the first day, guests arrive and we stay in downtown Jackson Hole, and we do an introductory presentation of what to expect, and we get to know one another. And what's really special about these trips is that it's a partnership between Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund. And because of that, these trips are very conservation focused. And so it brings together people who not only care about these landscapes and want to see them, but they also want to protect them and they want to learn about them. So the connections that happen on these trips are really genuine, and I've stayed in touch with many of the guests that I've guided over the last few years, just because it's a really wonderful group of people. On the second day, it's really exploring Grand Teton National Park, and one of the highlights, no matter what the weather is, because sometimes in this image we had thunderstorms and rain while we were floating the Snake River. I've had sunny days, I've had rainy days. It's just an unreal experience to be able to see the Tetons while you're floating down the Snake, and perhaps you'll encounter some wildlife along the way. On the next day, we travel up into the Old Faithful area, where there are many different geothermal features to explore. And this day is when we first enter Yellowstone National Park, and we actually stay near Old Faithful to be able to spend as much time as we can with these geothermal features. And what's really neat on this day, because we stay inside the park, is getting to go out at sunset or at sunrise, and those late and early times when very few people are out on the boardwalks, and you really get to experience it as if you're the first one exploring that area, which is really special. Day 4, we really head into Hayden Valley and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. And these are just kind of little highlights. We pack in so many different places and experiences along the way. And we really do kind of highlight some areas that you might not get to see or explore if you were to go on your own, that you might not know about. All the guides are connected to one another and other guides who are in the area to be able to find out where the wildlife are spending most of their time. Day 5 is when we head up to the LAMAR Valley, and this is when we really put in some early mornings and late evenings to be able to mirror what the wildlife are doing in terms of their activity. And so you have a great chance to see bison, there's a chance to see wolves, and we spend 2 days in Lamar Valley, and we do that by staying in Cook City, which is in the northeast entrance to the park. And that gives us a really good home base of operations so that we can spend as much time as possible in this northern range, which is just the wolf dense area to give you the best possible chance of seeing wildlife. And these are the vehicles that we travel around in, and they've got roof hatches that open to be able to allow you to take really safe pictures while you're viewing wildlife. And then we also have opportunities to go for hikes and explore this landscape while you learn about it. Day 7, we head up to Bozeman and have a departure day. So, this is a photo from one of the spring trips that I guided, taking a picture at the Yellowstone National Park sign. So I would love to open it up for questions. Please reach out to me if you have any questions at all. And if you're interested in continuing the conversation, you can follow me on Instagram, check out the gallery. It's these trips with Natural Habitat Adventures are just amazing opportunities, and I feel very fortunate to be able to work for Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund to be able to share these places both through webinars and through visiting. And I hope that you enjoyed the chat, and would love to chat with you more. And just to flag a couple items here, if you enjoyed today's talk, you can join me again on August 1st, and we'll talk about different insects that rely on milkweed. And I have a huge milkweed prairie in the backyard, and so there are a lot of insects that I follow through photography, and we'll take a look at those, and we'll also talk about the monarch trip down to Michoacan, Mexico, where millions of monarchs congregate and overwinter on their incredible migration. On August 17th, we'll dial back in for northern peatlands. This is a current photography project that I'm working on that'll be featured in an exhibit this fall. And this is a lot of aerial photography looking at northern peatlands, and we'll explore those ecosystems. We have some of the largest peatlands in New York State, just a few miles from my home. And a lot of these landscapes can't be explored by foot because it hurts the ecosystem. And so being able to fly drones and get aerial imagery allows people to virtually experience this landscape that is just stunning and surprising and magnificent. So I'd love to go back here and open it up for questions.
All right, thank you so much. Now, before we start in with the questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to these questions. So when was it that you said the moose gather in the Grand Teton, and how intense is the elk rut in the Grand Teton?
Great questions, thank you. So the moose gather in about May into early June, and it's a little bit different every year. The years that I lived in Kelly, it was happening at that time, and it's really rare to be able to see that many adult moose together in one place, like we were talking about. And then the elk rut is the other highlight time to be able to visit, because the crowds start to die down, and the wildlife are doing really interesting behaviors in September into October. Some of those rut behaviors are starting at the end of August, but I'll be heading out to Yellowstone September 13th, and I expect to hear a lot of elk bugling. And for those that might not know, a lot of these large animals go into what's called the rut, which is mating season, and their behaviors shift. And so in the fall, elk, the bull elk, are gathering what are called harems, which are huge congregations of female elk, and they are protecting that herd. And they will spar with other bull elk and try to take over the harem and take control of the harem. And while they're doing that, one of the ways that they display their prowess is through these dramatic bugling calls. And so it's just, there's nothing more magnificent than being out on the sagebrush flats in the fall. The aspen trees are yellow, and all of a sudden you hear just this mysterious, dramatic elk bugle as they're staking out their territories. Thanks for that question. Any other questions?
Sorry about that. I inadvertently muted myself. Do you know what the population of the wolves are now?
That's a great question. So there are a lot, as I mentioned, wolves were removed from the landscape by the US government in the early 1900s. The last wolf, I believe, was in 1925, was hunted to local extirpation, because wolves didn't go extinct at that point. They were just locally extinct in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And they were reintroduced in 1995. And since then, their population grew fairly quickly within Yellowstone National Park. And then it peaked and stabilized. So every ecosystem has what's called a carrying capacity for each species. And what that means is the number of individuals that can be supported by the natural landscape at that time. And wolf population has fluctuated since 1995 for any number of factors, from whether or not hunting is legal or illegal, because wolves have been both listed and delisted many times since 1995 on the Endangered Species Act, which puts in federal protections, which is why that would be illegal to hunt them during that time. But so the current wolf population is a bit lower than the carrying capacity that we know from studying wolves from 1995 until now. But it's still a healthy population. What's more concerning is that the hunting pressures that have happened over the last few years, when the wolves have been delisted and hunting is allowed in the states where so when wolves are delisted, the management plan for whether wolves can be hunted goes to the individual states. And so Yellowstone National Park is protected. You can't hunt wolves within the park, but as soon as they cross that border into the surrounding states, they are then able to be hunted if they are not listed. So, long answer to your question, wolves are a little bit lower than their typical carrying capacity, and I believe it looks like it's healthy to have between 110 and 150 wolves in Yellowstone National Park, but the numbers are always changing, and I'd be able to check that stat for you.
So where do the elk migrate to and from?
Yeah, that's also a good question. There are different populations of migratory elk. And so there are some elk that live in Yellowstone National Park in the summer and then migrate to the north into Montana. There are some elk that spend the whole year round in Grand Teton, but they make some small migrations from the foothills down to the flats in the winter. So it depends on the population of elk, and some of them are traveling very far, and some of them are traveling shorter distances.
Great, thank you very much for covering that. Let's see. So, can you talk about what camera and lens that you use?
Yeah, of course. So when I first started studying photography, I was renting a camera from school, and I was using a Canon system. So at the time, I had access to 50mm macro lens, and then a 200mm lens and a 300mm lens, as well as a short lens and a medium lens. And so I shot Canon for a long time, and then when I was doing work in the fall from a high wing plane, I started to get really frustrated with the color correction that Canon has native to the camera. And just to my eye, I like to try and reproduce what I saw as close as possible. And I found that Nikon cameras have a more flat color profile so that then you can edit afterwards to be able to get it back to what you remember seeing. So personally, I shoot with Nikon. I have a Z6 that I use and have a collection of lenses that goes with that. And then I use a DJI Mavic 3 Pro for my aerial photography as well. But those are my go-tos. I also have a D810, but to my understanding, all of the major camera companies it's just down to personal preference at this point. Everybody is so competitive. Everyone has incredible technology. It's just what your eye prefers. And at the time, I loved Canon for when I used it. And then I enjoyed shifting over to Nikon because of that more natural, neutral color profile.
Would you recommend Nikon for an amateur?
Absolutely. Whenever you're shooting in auto, they will boost the color for you. For when I'm shooting photography, I'm shooting in what's called a raw file format. And so that format shoots really neutral, really flat. When you look at the picture as it comes out of the camera, you'd say, gosh, there's not a lot of life to it. And that's because most of my work happens on the computer to be able to recreate what I saw. You look at someone like Ansel Adams, and he was a wizard in the darkroom. Everything that we're doing with Photoshop now was being done then just with burning and dodging and doing working magic in the darkroom with chemicals. So as in terms of a beginner, there's no wrong way. What I'd encourage you to do is go to a camera store and look at the menus of each camera and see which one feels the most intuitive to you. That's the most important thing. All of these cameras will take incredible shots. They have slightly different software that will reproduce color in a different way. But honestly, you can't go wrong.
Thank you so much for that recommendation. We appreciate it. Let's circle back to the wolves for a second. Do we know how healthy their genetic diversity is right now?
That's a really good question. There's a group of researchers that just published a study that was looking at genetic diversity and population dynamics. It's really hard. So let me back up a little bit. Looking at genetics, each species has a genetic clock, and that genetic clock is essentially the rate at which our DNA introduces mutations or variations. So when I was studying turtles, it takes a really long time for those mutations to happen or those changes to happen. So if you start to have inbreeding, if you have a slow clock, it will take a really long time for you to then be able to see that by studying the DNA of a specific individual or a population. And so with wolves, they've reintroduced them since 1995. They reintroduced them with Canadian wolves, which are the same species, but they were living in Canada at the time. And so it's my perspective that not enough time has passed from 1995 until now for us to be able to really see whether there's, and especially with the recent drop in population of wolves, it's too early to tell from a genetics perspective if they're less than healthy, if that makes sense. So it's a complicated question, and there are a lot of researchers studying it. But I haven't seen anything definitive about that. But my gut instinct and what I know about wolves in Yellowstone is that it's a very healthy population, and that the challenge right now is because of the hunting pressure over the last few years. The big issue is that the wolf populations have been destabilized. So wolves have a really hierarchical structure. They have a huge social structure within their pack and between packs, and a pecking order, essentially. Though we're starting to learn that the concept of alpha wolf is a little bit not quite right, because it's much more complicated than that. But the idea is that if a wolf happens to leave the geopolitical boundary of Yellowstone National Park and enter a state where it is legal to hunt, and that wolf is removed, it destabilizes the pack. And because in the last handful of years, going back the last 5-10 years, wolves have been able to be hunted in a number of different times, the wolf packs in Yellowstone National Park are really unstable and changing a lot. So this is where it becomes really interesting looking at policy, because there are a number of people arguing, hey, the wolf population is healthy, that if you look at strict numbers, they're doing really well. But then there might be another camp of researchers or people who are advocating that even though the numbers are good, the dynamics within the population aren't fully healthy because they haven't had enough time to stabilize and form their pack structures that they need to be able to withstand changes. For instance, if the packs are destabilized and then mange comes through or disease comes through and further reduces the population, you might be left with wolves who don't know how to hunt. Wolves are teachers. They teach their young how to hunt and how to be a good wolf. And if you don't have any good teachers, you start to have wolf packs that are less successful. So it's a really complicated question, really hard to answer, but my kind of short, condensed response version is that it's a dynamic time for wolves right now in Yellowstone National Park. We're seeing a lot of shifts between packs and pack dynamics, and that is in large part due to the fact that so much hunting has changed the composition of wolves in the valley.
Are they ever euthanized to control their population numbers?
That's a great question. In a number of states, regardless of whether wolves are listed or delisted on the Endangered Species Act, there's a stipulation that if wolves are or any species is a nuisance species and actively hunting livestock, it can be shot and killed. And so if those laws are in effect in states, then a rancher has the ability to protect their livestock in that scenario. So, but as far as hunting them to control their population, that is not, to my knowledge, being done right now.
So what bears are going to be found in the area, and do we know when they typically go into hibernation?
And Rob, you said what bears?
Yes, what bears?
Okay, yeah. So you've got a good chance of seeing black bears and grizzly bears. You'll also see black bears that have either black or cinnamon coats. So it's the same species, a black bear, but sometimes you'll see what people call a cinnamon bear, but that's just a black bear that has a different color. And in the May, June time, bears are coming out of hibernation and they're very hungry and they're also taking care of their cubs. When I was out in Yellowstone this May and June guiding 2 trips, we saw bears both trips. We saw both species, grizzly and black bear. But it's just like every one of these wildlife, you can't guarantee it ever. Sometimes you have a trip where you see a lot of bears and sometimes you don't see them. But those are the 2 species, and really, other than winter because they hibernate, you have a shot of seeing bears from spring through fall.
What are the chances of us seeing a wolf?
Yeah, so it's really hard to predict. So this year has been a great year for wolf watching simply because of where the wolves decided to den. There was a wolf pack that was denning in Slough Creek, which you can drive right into, and right from a couple of the pull-offs, the den site is visible. So if you hang out at that spot all day, there's a chance that wolves will come back or move. But we're talking about the stability of packs and what's happening. That den site has moved since I was there in the spring. And at this point, wolves are less tied to their dens because the pups are bigger and they're moving about more. So it really just it totally depends on the year, on what the wildlife are doing, and on top of that, if you were to drive every single road in Yellowstone National Park, you would see less than 1% of the total land mass of Yellowstone. And so that just gives you an idea of these wolves could be just over a hillside and you would never see them. So that's, you know, another thing to keep in mind. So you always have a shot at seeing them, but it's not guaranteed. And if you do see them, you're likely seeing them through a spotting scope. We have incredible optics on these trips, and you get really familiar with using them. You learn how to use them. It's a great skill to have. And often when we're viewing wolves, we're viewing them through a scope, and you're seeing them way in the distance. And in the scope, they look close, but when you're looking with your naked eye, they're very, you know, pretty far away.
So other than the rafting part, what else do we experience in the Grand Teton?
Yeah, the Grand Teton portion is really dependent on what wildlife are doing and what time of year you're visiting. So we travel from town up to Jackson Lake Lodge, which is where we stay on that second night, which is an absolutely phenomenal location, beautiful views. And on that trajectory there, it's kind of each guide has their special spots that they want to take you to. And there are a lot of different options of what can happen depending on where the wildlife are. So it's kind of a hard question to answer depending on when you go, which guide you have, but there's never a place that you go that is going to be less than the other place. It's just there's so much to see. And I think that is one thing I would recommend in terms of if you're figuring out if you want to go Bozeman to Jackson or Jackson to Bozeman, think about where you want to spend more time. Like if you want to tag on a couple days in the beginning of your trip or at the end, I would recommend more days in Grand Teton National Park. There's so much to see there. This trip spends a lot of time in Lamar Valley because that's where you can maximize seeing as many big wildlife species as possible. And we get to see some incredible things in Grand Teton National Park. And part of it is because that's where I lived for some time. But definitely try and spend some more time there if you have the flexibility.
What time of year do these trips run?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are trips year round in Yellowstone National Park, but this particular itinerary runs May through end of September, early October. And so I'll be running another trip this September, and usually there are 12 to 14 guests, 2 guides on each trip, 2 vans, and each guest gets a window seat. So you're in those Mercedes Sprinter vans with roof hatches, and it's just a well thought out itinerary. And you know, a portion of your purchase goes towards World Wildlife Fund and conservation, and the, you know, the vendors and the partners that are selected on this trip are all you know, helping to support local tourism and the ecosystem itself. So it's a neat opportunity.
Can you talk about what the physical requirements are for the trip?
Yeah, and that's definitely a question that the trip planners can help you with too, to answer more specifically. But this trip, it's short hikes, and typically because we have 2 guides, we can accommodate differing interests or abilities. But it does require like being able to walk about and potentially be on uneven ground. This is not a backcountry hiking trip. This is a wildlife viewing safari that includes opportunities to be able to hike and move about, but it's also covering a lot of ground so that you can see as much as possible.
Is there a Photo Pro version of this itinerary?
In the winter, there's a Photo Pro version that focuses specifically on wolves. So if you're interested in that, that's a great opportunity. And you know, you go up in snow coaches, which are big, essentially like trucks on top of snowmobile treads, to be able to get you up to Old Faithful area and then go out and explore the park that way. And so that's a really incredible opportunity to be able to photograph some of these wildlife. But what I would say too, is that even the non-photography trips, I'll often have guests who bring all of their camera equipment and they're there to take photos. Like these trips are ecology-based trips, but each guest kind of brings their own interests and what their, goals for what they're trying to see.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for some closing comments.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm really glad that you joined me today. I hope you all have wonderful weekends, and I hope you'll join me either on August 1st to talk about some of the incredible insects that rely on milkweed, including the monarch butterfly, and also on August 17th to take a tour through northern peatlands and find out about some of the greatest carbon sinks that our planet has to offer, and one of the greatest climate solutions available right now. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to connecting with you. Feel free to reach out with questions, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you could travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.